Welcome to Feel Seen Space. We are a digital platform designed for artists and creatives who yearn for more. At a time of massive change, what does it mean to create? What role does artistic expression serve for the individual and the collective? On this podcast, we try to answer these questions by interviewing artists on their holistic creative processes, their work, and their personal journey.
In this episode of Feel Seen Space, I'm so excited to welcome Holly Hay, a London-based image director whose visionary eye has shaped some of the most inspiring campaigns and stories around the globe. Holly is someone whose work I've long admired, from her time as photography director at Wallpaper and Another magazine to leading now her own agency, ANNIKA, where she brings bold, beautiful ideas to life. She collaborates with incredible names like Dover Street Market, Hermes, Stella McCartney, USM, and Uniqlo, creating work that spans print, digital, exhibition, and publishing, always with a thoughtful and distinctive touch. Today, we get to hear her story, dive into her creative philosophy, and see the world of photography through her remarkable perspective and lens. Let's begin. Hi, how are you?
Hello, how are you?
Good. Welcome to the podcast. We're so excited to have you today.
Thank you for having me, both of you.
So let's dive right into it. Where are you in the world right now?
So I'm in London. I'm a born and bred Londoner. I've actually never lived anywhere else. Which is quite rare, I guess. Me and London have a slightly complex relationship. I love London, of course, and I fall back in love with London quite often. But it can, the city you live in can also let you down a little bit. And I'm always quite kind of sensitive to that. I don't want to ever feel like I just exist somewhere. London's a challenging place to be and to survive in. And so you kind of have to remember to use the city to feel like, it's really worth being here and worth trying so hard to be here.
Yeah, I feel it can be draining to be in a big city like London. Did you grow up in London, actually?
Yeah. So I grew up in North London, but very centrally. I've always lived very centrally, and all of my school friends are still here. So yeah, I'm very grounded in London. I actually moved to South London, which is like what you absolutely don't do as a Londoner, move from North London to South London. It's totally unheard of. But it's been really nice building a kind of new community as a grown up in a different place, the bit that I didn't grow up in, and kind of rediscovering a new part of London.
So let's talk a little bit about your childhood. Did you grow up in a creative family?
Well, yeah, I did. My dad was an architect. I kind of realized more and more how similar I've become to him. He loved being quite contrary. Was very happy having difficult conversations for a better creative output. My mum was a businesswoman. She ran childcare nurseries, but was always such a creative thinker. And I think she definitely showed me the power of being good with people. And they both had a completely unmatched work ethic, which I've definitely inherited, but also tried to inherit, forced it upon myself. Yeah, so their careers and their drive was incredibly inspiring to me growing up.
That's amazing that you had this model family, in a sense, to help you to create and to pursue your creative path.
Absolutely, and certainly the approach that anything was possible, your dreams were possible, was something that was always instilled in me.
And I'm sure they push you to go to St. Martin's and pursue your creative career.
Exactly that. Exactly that. There was nothing kind of felt nothing felt off limits to me, you know? Um, and I do think about that sometimes, my attitude at St. Martin's and kind of coming out of that time was always so optimistic, maybe naively so. I just always thought it was going to work out. And I think that confidence has been helpful because I've never wavered on the direction I wanted to go on. And they've really supported that.
I feel it's a great attitude to have, especially in this industry. You need to
Yeah.
have the strength and the confidence. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your background. You wanted to be a photographer at some point, and then you kind of shift gear.
Yeah, so the course I did at St. Martin's was called Fashion Communication with Promotion. It's a very small course within the fashion department at St. Martin's. I think at the time there were maybe 11 of us on the course, but it was a time when magazines felt particularly important. Um, I remember while I was there, I read this quote like that Charlotte Cotton had been in conversation with Joanne Furness, and they'd said, you know, we're always thinking about this kind of critical question around who are the arbiters that say this is interesting now. And I guess this was the period where magazines had been so important at doing that, about highlighting what was important and interesting about industry and culture. And so the course really guided you towards those kinds of careers. Some people became journalists, some people worked in PR, some people became stylists, art directors, photographers. So it was very broad, but it really was focused on media and magazines. So I started at Garage before they'd launched the first issue of the magazine. And I'd kind of heard rumblings about it because a very good friend of mine at university was very close with the fashion director who'd gone there. She had gone from Tank to Garage. And I guess I hadn't really thought too hard about my career at that point. I was taking photos. I'd had some really nice opportunities with that. I was doing a lot of backstage photography. So it had led to some really nice opportunities. I was doing backstage at fashion shows, but I was also shooting like B-roll photography for David Sims on campaign. So I was, you know, I was working, but I was working in a little boutique in Islington, a clothing boutique, and I loved it. You know, actually the people that I met there have remained some of my closest friends, but also most amazing creative community.
Nice.
And they had decided to close down the women's wear store. And I was working one day with my friend Audrey, and she was like, God, have you thought about what you're going to do? And I was like, no, not at all. I haven't thought about what am I going to do. I went downstairs that day on my lunch break and was on Facebook or whatever, and saw that Garage were looking for like a production assistant. And
Okay.
honestly, I had absolutely no idea what production even was. That was something I didn't learn at St. Martin's, the real world roles within organizations. And so I applied for the job, and honestly, I think because of the St. Martin's connection is why they interviewed me, is why they felt that there was like a kind of level of training, even if it wasn't specific to the job itself. They knew kind of how thorough you were coming out of a course like that.
Hmm.
You know, attention to detail, things like that. And so I was so lucky, and I got the job. So yeah, that was my very first role at a magazine, and it definitely felt like sort of playing at running a magazine. None of us knew what the hell we were doing. There was about three or four of us, but it was an incredible first learning experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. And is it at that point that you said to yourself, maybe I don't want to pursue being a photographer and then I want to be more working into like commissioning and image direction?
Exactly. I didn't even know these roles existed. I didn't know that you could be part of the photography process without being the one who took the picture. And it's where I realized, well, saw firsthand the dedication it took to create and master a career in that area. Like such a dedicated practice, but also I realized I just preferred other people's work to my own. I wasn't, you know, I wasn't a technical photographer, so I realized I couldn't actually achieve, like, it just wasn't what I want. I didn't sort of connect to my work in the same way that I connected to other people's work. And it was such an amazing moment when I realized I could be part of the conversation and be at the table without taking the picture.
Yeah. And it's interesting because there's so many roles like this you cannot learn at school. So you need to be really like in the industry, trial and error, and just meet the right people. And this is kind of serendipity where I feel you can have all the technical skills, but then you meet someone or you have an experience that lead to something else.
Exactly that. Exactly that. It's being able to access the opportunities, isn't it? To show what you can do and how dedicated you can be. But you need the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, and I'm curious to hear more about how you kept your confidence because the industry is pretty cutthroat and you started as a production assistant and then you had this very important role as photo director at these amazing fashion magazines. So what was your process?
I think garage is where I learned how I didn't want to work, if I'm honest. It was a really hard entry point into the industry. I was working for one of the richest women in the world. She, you know, it was run by Dasha Zukova. I was paid £12,000 a year.
Wow.
So like completely unsurvivable. And so I had to take work on the side. And it's where I learned that learned how to navigate other people's expectations of you and what you are willing to do for that. You know, I remember this situation where it was over Christmas. Dasher had gone to St. Bart's, bumped into Patrick de Marchelier on the beach, was like, "We're going to do a shoot here." I was like, "What?" And trying to produce a shoot while people are like on a yacht or whatever. I mean, the whole thing was absolute chaos. And I had this BlackBerry that was ringing off the hook over my Christmas holidays with my family. And it made me realize that as much as I really wanted to make that job work, I wasn't willing to sacrifice myself, my family, my life for that. And so I had to have this very difficult conversation with my boss at the time. And actually, that honesty that came from that conversation led to a level of respect. And, just because other people hadn't put those boundaries in place, it didn't mean that I wasn't able to do that. And so I thought I was going to be fired after the conversation. I thought, I was going to be seen as not dedicated enough. But actually the opposite happened. And that kind of realization that I'd had was really embraced. But it had to get quite bad before I was able to have that conversation. And that's really difficult in our industry, right? We spend a lot of time making ourselves completely indispensable or trying to. But sometimes that can be really at the expense of ourselves and the people who are really important around us. But you can't be fired for asking a question, and to want to know a little bit more about if there's a different way of working and how to get the best out of each other. You can't be fired for that. So, but there is a lot of fear around those conversations, I find. And I was very fearful of having those conversations then. But certainly being able to do that then has set me up in the most amazing way moving forward. I think absolutely I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had, but we are told we have to be so grateful,
Yeah, especially in the fashion industry. A lot of people cannot set boundaries. And I think it's so inspiring that early in your career, you were able to do that. And I feel that your self-worth was already big enough for you to say, I'm not going to accept these toxic situation. When you face these challenging time or situation with clients or people, how did you manage to get out of these toxic relationship?
So a lot changed for me when I went to wallpaper. Um, there was something about the level of respect and autonomy that I was given when I got that role. I came in at a really interesting time because Sarah Douglas, who had been the creative director, had moved on to be the editor-in-chief of the magazine. And that was quite a kind of common journey within wallpaper, that they would have a very visual editor. But it also marked a kind of shift from it being a sort of boys' club, which it had been previously. It was this very powerful woman at the top of a magazine who was just about to have a baby and had been given this role. And that felt like a very powerful moment in a commercial magazine group. Her employing me as her kind of eyes and ears when her job was shifting was amazing for me. So she employed me, and then a week later she went on mat leave. So she was like, yeah, we're aligned, go do it. And I had to kind of navigate making changes within an organization where people had really been there for a very, very long time, 15 years plus people had been there. So there were people who really didn't understand why something needed to shift and change at all. So I very, very early in the job, I was confronted with these huge challenges because I didn't want to change everything under everybody's nose. I'd had such huge respect for the magazine. It had been the one magazine my parents had subscribed to forever. I'd grown up around it. It was my dream job. There's no way I wanted to go in and scratch the past away. But I think what I decided was I would treat all of these difficult conversations and potential confrontations as career development. Like, if I could go into a conversation that I knew was going to make me feel so uneasy, but I treat it like I am going to learn something from this conversation and I am going to come out making this other person realize that we both want the same thing. We just have different paths to get there, and we can both get what we want from this. And that is how I decided to treat confrontation within my role there, and it transformed my experience. Because it's not that I was detached, that's not what it was. It was just, this is part of it.
Yeah.
These difficult conversations is a part of my everyday. And so if I can learn to actually get something from them, I'm not going to dread them anymore.
A lot of people are afraid to speak up,
Yeah.
and that create even more resentment and more problems. So I think you went there with the right mindset.
Yeah, and God, it wasn't easy, and I certainly wasn't everyone's favorite person, but I also, another had been such a family. And I think when you work for a founder-led company, that is the atmosphere that's promoted, that everyone's kind of in the trenches together, getting their hands dirty. And Wallpaper wasn't that. It wasn't, you never felt like you were spending someone's money. It was a business. So you could go in with a slightly different perspective. It didn't feel so personal anymore. And that has really helped me.
And did you have a mentor or someone that you could really trust during these years?
I mean, always in my roles, I've been really lucky. When I was at St. Martin's, we did a kind of sandwich year. So it was a 4-year course, and you'd go off and do a year in the industry. And some of that time I spent at Show Studio, and it was when Penny Martin was there. The person working under Penny was an editor called Laura Bradley, and she was the year above me at St. Martin's. And she'd kind of stayed on her year in the industry. So she'd stayed a bit longer. To really kind of bed into Show Studio and work with them. They were incredible as part of, the foundations for my journey. They really supported my next steps. And then at Garage, Becky Pushti, who was the managing editor there at the time, she's now gone on to work for Art and Commerce for a really long time. When she left Garage, she went to Art and Commerce. She's been an incredible source of advice and gives me a really good perspective on the industry, and kind of reminds me of the kind of bigger picture. And then Sarah at Wallpaper, the editor who employed me, she gave me so much confidence, honestly. It allowed me to become who I wanted to be in the industry. Own the job I wanted to own. It really gave me that confidence. But I guess sort of more recently, I feel very inspired by the kind of young people that surround me, the students I teach and the assistants, the people that I work with when I work within companies. I think there's such a reminder to stay curious when you're around young people, and a reminder to feel really honored, to be part of something. So yeah, I guess it's kind of slightly switched now that I look to those people for a reminder of why I'm here, I guess.
You're also an amazing mentors for these up and coming emerging artists. You have an amazing eye. You started also your company, ANNIKA, an image direction studio. So I would like to hear more about what you're looking for in terms of collaboration when you commission artists.
So I look for a real dedication to a practice. It's interesting when you're looking at students' work because we used to do this graduate directory at Wallpaper, and it took a hell of a lot of research to do. And what you could kind of realize the difference between somebody who really wanted to develop a practice that was going to go beyond those walls and those who'd been set a really good project and produced a really good image off the back of it. And so the process of doing the grad directory really taught me about looking quite forensically at someone's work and really trying to understand process. I'm also really only interested in people who are very deeply curious, who are open to where their practice can take them, open to where collaborative projects can push their practice in a direction they didn't foresee. So I'm kind of interested in working with people. You know, for example, at Wallpaper, I wasn't that interested in working with a fashion photographer for a fashion shoot. I was like, how can we build a language together, which is something that you do for this, but you don't do for anyone else, and it kind of scratches an itch that you have. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in how, between the client and the artist, I can create these like new languages within someone's work that they've been curious about, but maybe not had the opportunities to explore. Rather than feel like I'm ticking a box, being like, oh, I got that person to shoot a fashion project and they've done it for this, this, and this. Isn't that great that they've done it for us too? You know, that doesn't interest me quite so much.
And did you start ANNIKA because you were craving more freedom, or what was the vision when you started?
To be honest, at the start, it was quite accidental. um, I have worked in editorial a really long time, and I'm, as you guys know, in London, that doesn't necessarily sustain a lifestyle in London. Um, so I've always done freelance work on the side, and I got to a point where it was during COVID and a lot of in-house teams had really reduced. And so they were outsourcing a lot of creative. And so I was actually getting a lot more opportunities to run an entire project end to end rather than kind of parachuting in, doing some art buying or a little bit of direction. I was being asked to handle the budget and run the whole project. And so I actually had to become a VAT registered company because of a project I was doing with Dover Street sort of overnight, to be able to take on the project. And my husband and one of his friends, who was a CGI artist, had made a new company during COVID when they weren't shooting to do kind of after effects for films and stuff. And I said, well, will you make me a director of that company so I can run my projects through that for a bit? And that was ANNIKA. And they'd started it, they'd done the logo, they'd thought of the name, it was their company. And then obviously they went back to their jobs, and weren't using it anymore. So I made it my company. I was like, I'm not paying them dividends. They haven't been doing any work. Um, So that's, and for me, it was actually really, although it was kind of by chance that happened, it was incredibly useful because it sort of felt like I was going to work. Like it wasn't a company I'd started. I wasn't like, oh, it wasn't my name. It wasn't, it felt like I could be sort of strategic with it. And because of the time we were in, I was getting these projects, and it got to this point where I was becoming too thinly spread between the magazine and the projects I was doing outside of that. And I just remember being on set once with a client and getting like 15 missed calls from the office, and I'd like booked it as holiday and all the rest. And I was like, I'm not doing either of these things very well, I've got to make a choice. And I'd never really decided to go and get work. I'd never, I'd been really lucky and things had come to me, and I'd kind of nurtured those relationships, but I hadn't gone out there and really tried to make it work. So I sort of felt like I owed it to myself to give it a go. I was also at that point in my life, I had a kid and he was going to school, so I wasn't in like the hideous financial strain of like nursery fees anymore. And it didn't feel quite so pressured. Also, my husband owns his own company too, so I felt like we'd been in that kind of survival mode for a little bit, where I definitely needed to know how much money I was bringing home every month. But that kind of slightly released a bit, that pressure, and gave me the opportunity to have some time to try and build ANNIKA into what I wanted it to be.
And for you, community and the collaboration with artists is so, so important. And the magazine industry is changing. If you would have one advice to give up and coming artists, what would it be?
What would it be? I think you need to find various ways of showing up. So it's not just about doing that editorial in that magazine that will make you get noticed. It's, are you applying for all of the competitions that you could access? Are you going to other people's book launches and supporting other people and the photographic community as a whole? Are you, in London, you have access to those conversations because you can turn up and have them. And that's what's incredible about being here. So are you allowing yourself to access those things? How are you putting out your personal work? I don't think there's any harm in people seeing a kind of work in progress approach and seeing something before it's become this like beautiful bound book. It doesn't need to be that. It just needs to be planting those seeds, and they need to be scattered, but you also need to not fiddle with them too much. You need to trust the process of being out there, putting your work out there, having conversations, and trusting that will come back.
Yeah, trusting the process, I think is the most important thing. And never give up, because everything is possible.
Absolutely anything is possible. And yeah, I guess not take the silence personally.
Do you ever lose track on your creative projects? Maybe you're a professional artist or creative, but what used to be your passion now feels uninspiring. Or maybe you decided to pursue a safer career path, but you just know you have that artistic side of you that's dying to come out. At Feel Seen Space, our mission is to get you back in touch with your creativity, your flow, and your purpose. If you're ready to feel seen, we offer one-on-one holistic mentoring sessions designed to reconnect you to your inner artist. You'll find all the information at the link in the show notes. We hope to see you soon. So you talked a lot, obviously, about London, where you lived and worked your whole life. But it seems from an outsider's perspective, because I've only ever been living in Paris and New York, that London is so associated with photography. Why do you think that is?
I think there's always been a level of creative freedom here that has been encouraged and embraced. The idea of someone's personal practice being as much part of what you're looking at as their kind of commercial credentials. It's always been incredibly important here, and so it kind of becomes the culture of a place. I don't think anyone set out to do it, but I certainly know from speaking to photographers that London sort of represents a certain sense of freedom to them in their work. That doesn't necessarily translate to like financial gain, sadly, which is slightly lacking in London. But absolutely, the idea of dedicating yourself to a photographic practice and being able to move through these worlds as well, being able to quite successfully have an art practice and a commercial one, that's all quite accepted here. You don't have to be one or the other. I think what has been building hasn't always existed here, but certainly does now, is the community of photographers who speak with each other and share and support each other's work. I don't think that's always happened, I have to say, but I think there's been a really big movement in the last 5 or so years that really feels like it happens. And honestly, it takes these certain people in certain positions to encourage that. So like, there are certain agencies who put on shows and create that amazing community. There's a brilliant young curator here called Jamie Shaw, who is attached to the agency East, but they have a gallery space, and he's created the most amazing community around that space. Like, you see every photographer in London, from students to very established names, and everyone is there on a level playing field. Everyone's there for the same reason, because they want to be part of that landscape. And that's incredibly important. And also, Roxanne, I know you know Kalpesh really well as well. It's like people like that who are working in education and working as a photographer, who are grassroots making those connections happen between people, is incredibly important. And it spreads, it spreads, and that's a very special thing about London.
So yeah, that's the importance of community in fueling that creativity and just making sure that the youngsters are still inspired and learn from their mentors. Like, what do you think it creates?
It creates surprising results. It creates new ways of working. And I think because it's so hard here, like, the creative community are the most qualified at pivoting in difficult times. They're the ones who are finding new ways of working, new ways of communicating their work, new ways of being satisfied within their own processes. And that fuels the whole thing. That fuels the whole system, that energy. but it almost takes living somewhere where it's not crazy buoyant. There aren't jobs for every, it doesn't feel financially stable. But what comes out of that is incredible creative process.
That's interesting because I was going to dive deeper later on in AI and the obviously the revolution that it causes in image making. But I feel like that's the big difference between a photograph and an AI created image is that there is no constraints and therefore there's no message and no depth to it because it's from that tension that we get interesting work, I think.
And it can't do anything brand new. It relies on the sources that it has, AI. So it can't create something we haven't seen before. And so it relies completely on a creative mind who has technical knowledge, incredible references, and a wealth of knowledge to be able to make anything interesting. So in a way, even though there's a kind of revolution happening, I do believe it will become a tool rather than a takeover.
Because it reminds me a lot of what the painters used to say when photography arrived that, oh no, we're going to be replaced. This is so unfair. But then it pushed painters to do something very unique because they didn't have to, reproduce exactly what was going on. They were able to just put so much personality in their work. So maybe it's going to be a new era of creativity in photography.
Exactly. And, some processes can always be refined. I work with a lot of filmmakers and they spend a hell of a lot of time making treatments and bidding for jobs that might come off, might not. And AI has transformed some people's process in that of being able to sketch ideas and present a direction, but they would never dream of using it for the final result.
Right. That's interesting. And I'm curious also in the context of all that crazy evolution that has happened within the years that we've been working. As you mentioned, when you first started working, the magazines were really the reference for what was happening, what was, new and inspiring in culture. Now that is no longer the case. What do you think the magazines stand for now that they don't really embody that newness? And how do you think that impacts photography and visuals?
So I think it's the kind of idea of the consumer magazine doesn't really exist anymore, right? And what we have instead is a very kind of B2B system. So the magazines are us talking to each other, us justifying our own intentions. And I think there's probably a legitimate place for that. It's kind of feeding a system a little bit. I have become slightly disillusioned by the system, but I think, there is a kind of system and people, the brands do still look at who's shooting for the magazines to see who are the people they should be taking notice of. And, it becomes quite important in the kind of network of designers and things like that. I think what's also interesting is I think we kind of went through this time where designers were perhaps responding to magazines in quite an interesting way. Like I felt like there was quite a lot that was being made for the picture rather than for a person. You'd see the same Balenciaga boots shot on every magazine cover. And you're like, oh yeah, I mean, those were made for a picture. They weren't made to walk in. They were made so that these pictures could be created. And so it was kind of this like feeding itself system. So it has a purpose, but not really beyond a kind of industry purpose, I think. It feels more exclusive than it's ever felt. It feels more gate-kept than it's ever felt.
It's true, actually. I feel like just as in design, it feels like what's working nowadays is the really, really high luxury and the really, really fast fashion. And like everything in the middle is struggling. And maybe it's the same thing for image, where you have this very elitist magazine industry. And then you have like the plethora of not so interesting images that you see every day.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That kind of idea of the high low, it definitely feels relevant. It also is something I've been talking about a little bit within the practice of artists, because I think quite a lot of people have been chasing this like sweet spot of getting commissioned work that looks like your work, right? And that has been the kind of what people have wanted to achieve. But if you are someone who is able to make your work, also, these photographers have very direct audiences with people who want to see their work and want to appreciate their work. Is it actually quite effective for a photographer to be able to put out a personal project themselves and then go get a job and get paid? I don't know. Something has started making me feel like perhaps we don't need to chase that perfect scenario anymore. And we can be quite satisfied with creating a career that earns us enough money to survive and allows us to make the work that we want to. Yeah, maybe it doesn't need to be so tied together.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well with photography for the past years, where it's almost became kind of, as you said, a formula where you're like, I need to show work that is different enough and appears different enough that people will think is my style and therefore hire me for this. But sometimes it becomes even fake. It's like, no one has done this, so I'm going to do that. And it's not authentic. And I feel like the purpose of an artist, as you were saying, is to do authentic work. So it became really weird like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that you've hit the nail on the head.
And so, okay, so we've been talking a lot about the photography milieu and business and fashion, but if we go back to you and your love for photography, do you remember what drew you to it from the first place? What do you feel like this artwork is so unique and so different to every other?
I I went to this show. Um, it was the Sam Taylor Wood show. I think it was at the Hayward Gallery, and that show made me want to be part of photography. That storytelling was like I'd never seen anything like it in my life. It was such an inspiring moment for me. And I found it so interesting because she was kind of part of this world. She was, part of Jay Jopling's world. She was kind of, she had these celebrity friends, so she kind of borrowed from those places a little bit. And I found that so fascinating that you could borrow ideas from a kind of very commercial and recognizable world and put them into a completely different context. So yeah, that show, God, I dread to think the year that was. But that definitely changed everything for me. That was like, I want to be in this.
Amazing. And then later on, as you said, you started out by studying photography yourself and then being like, oh, I can just be the one who selects and have that storytelling element without it being my own words in a way.
Yeah.
So what is the job of a photo editor? What do you think makes a great photo editor?
I think for me, it's all based on dialogue and relationships. So it's having a continual dialogue with artists, agencies, galleries, all of those people, about people's work, but also about the intentions of the work. What are people trying to achieve for the work? And then my job is to kind of, I guess, match them with the right opportunities. So taking that knowledge and that insight that I have through the relationships and the dialogues that I build and making those opportunities happen. And there's obviously a lot that goes into that. It's actually something I was saying last term to the students. I was like, you just will never realize the amount of selling in and persuasion that goes in before you even know the job exists as a photographer. You know, the decks that I make that show someone's work and describing the work and describing the kind of person they are and what they're going to be like to work with, before I'm even sending the email to option them for the job, there's so much work that goes into that bit. And that's the balance of a photo editor or a photo director, I think. Also, it's about once you have the work, once the work has been delivered, it's what's the story now, because there's so much trust that goes into someone handing over their work to you. It sort of becomes more yours than it does theirs then. You're then the person who's delivering it to the design team who are laying it out on the page or on the billboard or as a series of Instagram posts, however that's going to manifest. And so the control has kind of been taken from the photographer then, and you feel this huge sense of responsibility to satisfy what they wanted to achieve from the project, but also be surprising. So that's when your kind of team is so important. I was freelancing for Port magazine for some time, and I was working with my friend Matt Curtis, who's a incredible design director. And, we would get into these like huge arguments because he would like crop a picture this big and like he wanted that bit of it. But he challenged me to see an image differently, to see how an image worked on the architecture of a page and not just as this thing that you could print and frame in your house and it would be beautiful as it is. It's like, we're now putting this into a new context. How can we get the best out of this work for this context? And, I was always so surprised, however kind of challenging that process had been between me and Matt, kind of navigating that. When we presented it to the photographer, I've never had a situation where they were like, I hate it, you can't do that to my picture. Most of the people we were working with were kind of delighted at the time we'd taken to look at the work and how the story was going to play out. So there's a kind of, when you're a photo editor, there are these kind of two sides of it, the before and the after. And there's a huge amount of responsibility within that. And you also want to surprise, but you want to do something that people haven't seen before or remind people of something that they'd forgotten. It's such a powerful tool if it's harnessed in the right way. And hopefully as a photo editor, you're given the autonomy to make the right decisions for whatever the platform is.
And do you have different criteria for different outlets? If it's commercial or more artistic or more editorial, do you look for different things in the artists?
No, I don't think so. I think, there's certainly, you think about how many people are going to be there. Is it a really big production? Can this person do that? Can they be the conductor of the orchestra? Because everyone looks to the photographer for the answers. And, I can be a bit of a buffer to that, but it's a very powerful position. So there are really certain types of people who thrive in that environment. And then there are people that need a more artist-led process in order to get the best work out of them. So you have to, that's why the kind of knowledge of the artist And their process is so essential because otherwise you're putting people in really difficult and unnecessary situations that just make everyone feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. So there's a huge human element to it as well.
Definitely. I mean, like, that's the biggest part.
That's crazy. And when you look at a photography with all of your backgrounds, do you feel like, because obviously there's the technical element to it where you look at the quality and everything, and then there's the more intellectual referenced part of your brain that's going to analyze the picture, but then there's also the sensitivity to the art. How do all of these elements mix within your analysis of a photograph?
Hmm.
Or is it just more instinctive than that?
I think it's possibly more instinctive than that. I suppose I slightly struggle when something is really over intellectualized. I think the way that we can communicate through photography is incredibly powerful, but that power comes in simplicity, not necessarily a picture of a tree with an essay, you know? Um, and that's just because I work in education as well, so you see a lot of sad looking trees. Um, and, you know, I'm sure there's a space for that work and that process, but I don't fit into that world. I fit into a world where I'm communicating through photography. And so it needs to have those links and those satisfying reference points that make you feel like you get it and maybe no one else does, you know? There's nothing like it when you look at an image and you understand the references and you understand what that is trying to communicate and why that's relevant now. So, yeah, I don't love feeling like I need a PhD to look at a picture, you know? That's a different world from mine.
And do you have criteria in terms of mediums? Because even within photography, now you have people who work like they did 100 years ago, and you have people who only work on iPhone maybe. So does that also influence the people you work with?
No, not at all. I'm really, you know, I love seeing people using different ways of working, and I can see how successfully that can be translated commercially as well, because, you know, even a way of working can be very simple to sell into a client because you're like, look how they approach this, they could do that for you, you know? Process-based artists, it's a really interesting way of working and a layer. I've been looking at this artist, it's a still life photographer that I've worked with for years, Luke Evans, and he's doing some really interesting stuff in the studio, experimenting with moving image, but kind of creating these like miniature galaxies within his studio just with what he has around him. And that kind of dedication to process and experimentation is so exciting. There's actually this really nice theory about a photographer being like a hunter or a farmer, a farmer kind of who cultivates their work. So perhaps that's someone who works in a studio setting and is very controlled over the environment, and then a hunter who goes out and finds their work in the world. I think it was Jeff Wall who said that actually. But I think there's something really interesting in both of those things, and also something interesting in the people who combine both and have both as part of their work.
That's so funny because when we first started doing our interviews for Feel Seen, we had like Roxanne and I for the first episodes. And I told her, I feel like you're a hunter because you go out and you're inspired by things. And I'm more of a fisherman because I feel like I'm like fishing within my own psyche or whatever. So it's kind of the same thing.
Totally. That's exactly it. Exactly it. That's so interesting.
We came to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
Okay, so for you, who are the photographers or any other artists that inspire you the most?
I mean, the list would be about, 10,000 long. I think Who is really inspiring me right now? I'm incredibly inspired by Sally Mann. I read her book Hold Still probably about 10 years ago, and I feel like the things I read in that book are still teaching me now. I think this kind of connection between photography and memory is so powerful. Some of the things that she talks about in that book are so inspiring and continually relevant. I also feel really inspired by artists the kind of bravery of artists and them pivoting their practice. There's a set designer called Lisa Jarvich, and she has fairly recently started experimenting within photography and film and using her, she worked on beautiful editorial projects as a set designer, beautiful campaigns, but she's using her knowledge of object and form and light and negative space and positive space and, all of those things, and transformed it into a practice that she has control over now. And she's straddling these worlds where she's doing, some campaigns and editorials for the most brilliant brands and magazines, but she's also having solo shows in these amazing galleries. And it's just so inspiring to see someone who has made such a huge move within their own work, so elegantly and confidently achieved it. Yeah, I find that very inspiring, because that's very hard to do, to make those shifts and the industry kind of accept them and embrace them. So I guess that'd be my top two right now.
Amazing. It's interesting because throughout this interview, you've made it very clear that you value risk-taking. You said that you had to have the hard conversations, that you went for the challenging industry, that you push artists to go outside their comfort zone. Why do you think that's so important?
I guess because we're always trying to push things forward, right? I mean, there's like a kind of human nature part of it where you slightly reject what's come before you, or want to reject what's come before you. But also, yeah, I really believe in like supporting the creative community in shifting the landscape, We don't want to see the same things over and over, and it's really hard to be new. So what you can do, if you can't necessarily create something that's never ever been seen before, is provide new context for work. Perhaps that's a wider audience for something, or a different audience for something, and that really excites me. I think that felt very powerful going to Wallpaper, because after being another where I felt like I was talking to a very small group of people, to go somewhere where you felt like there were quite a lot of eyeballs on that, and not just the PRs checking their credits or whatever. It was like, I saw the subscriber issues go out. I saw who those were going to, and they were going to the CEOs of all these companies and people who had a responsibility to pay attention to what was happening in culture, and they were looking at Wallpaper. That felt really exciting to get something out there in that way. And that's what I think now, rather than the kind of style titles being quite so powerful as they were, the supplements can be an incredibly powerful tool, because they're just so many people are seeing them. So there's such an opportunity there to show work that's challenging, that's pushing people. And yeah, it's the editors that have the responsibility to allow those people to be seen.
And what role do you think this type of pushing photography and art ultimately serve for humanity?
I guess it's about connecting people, isn't it? It's about telling stories that connect people, that make people feel like we're not alone in the world. Photography allows us to become aware of what's happening, what people are thinking about. It really puts a pin in culture. So, you know, draws that line in the sand of what's happening now that can be looked back on. And it all comes back to human connection, I think, and being able to relate and understand something.
So beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. We thank our guests for their trust, and we thank you for being a part of our community. If you like this episode and want to support our work, consider ranking our podcast on Apple or Spotify. And if you know someone who could benefit from this conversation, please share our work with them to help them spread the dream of a conscious, creative community. Talk soon.